She faced divorce with 2 young kids. How her faith led to an unbelievable transformation. Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Carter. I'm 42 years old and I live in Florida. I wanted to share my story with all of you here on the Divorce Stories channel because, honestly, divorce changed my life in ways I never imagined. It's been a decade since my divorce, and looking back, I can say it was one of the most challenging but also transformative experiences of my life. If you're watching this and going through something similar, I hope my story gives you a bit of hope and reassurance that brighter days do come, even after the darkest moments. So, here's my journey from the breaking point to building a new life. Looking back, I can hardly believe how long I held on. 14 years together, 7 years dating and another 7 married. And yet somehow we had drifted so far apart that we could barely recognize each other anymore. It's strange to think that something so meaningful could fade without either of us fully realizing it until it was too late. When my ex-husband and I first met, we were young, full of energy, and bursting with dreams of the future. We spent hours talking about life, love, and all the things we wanted to accomplish together. He was my first real love, the one I thought I would grow old with. We had so much in common, or at least that's what it seemed like back then. Over time, though, life began to happen. Careers, children, responsibilities. They all had a way of shifting our focus, slowly but surely pulling us apart. By the time we reached the 7th year of our marriage, things weren't what they used to be. We still loved each other, but something was missing. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment it all started to change, but looking back now, I see the signs were there all along. We had become more like roommates than partners, living parallel lives under the same roof. We went through the motions, raising our 2 children, working and managing the household, but the connection between us had faded. Conversations felt forced, our interactions were brief, and the silences between us grew longer and more uncomfortable. I think we both knew deep down that we were no longer the same people we had been when we first fell in love. But neither of us wanted to admit it. We clung to the idea of our marriage, to the memories of how things used to be, hoping that somehow we could find our way back to each other. I had convinced myself that this was just a rough patch, something every couple goes through, and that eventually we would figure it out. Then came the day that changed everything. I still remember it vividly. It was a regular day, nothing out of the ordinary. We were both at home, the kids were in the living room playing, and my husband and I were in the kitchen, barely speaking to each other. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. We had been arguing more frequently lately about small things, nothing major, but the fights always left a bitter taste in my mouth. That day, the argument wasn't even about anything important. We were frustrated with each other, and the conversation quickly spiraled into something bigger than either of us had intended. I can't remember exactly what was said, but I do remember the moment that shifted everything. In the middle of our back and forth, he stopped and looked at me. His face filled with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time, genuine concern. "Are we even happy anymore?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. For the first time, I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The walls I had built up to protect myself from facing the reality of our marriage came crashing down in an instant. I stood there, speechless, my mind racing. Was I happy? Were we happy? The truth was, I didn't know. I had been so focused on keeping everything together, taking care of the kids, managing the house, working part-time, that I hadn't stopped to think about my own happiness. I hadn't allowed myself to consider that maybe, just maybe, we weren't happy anymore. And from the look on his face, I knew he had been feeling the same way. There was a long silence between us as we both absorbed the weight of what had just been said. Then, without warning, the words I had been holding back for so long came spilling out. "I don't think I am," I admitted softly. "And I don't think you are either." It was the first time I had said it out loud, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. For months, maybe even years, I had been carrying the burden of our failing marriage, trying to convince myself that we could fix it, that things would get better. But in that moment, I realized that pretending everything was okay wasn't helping anyone. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, staring at me, processing what I had said. I could see the sadness in his eyes, the same sadness I had been feeling for so long but had been too afraid to acknowledge. We were both hurting, and we both knew what was coming next. That day marked the beginning of the end. We didn't make the decision to separate right then and there, but the conversation had opened the door to a reality we could no longer ignore. Over the next few weeks we talked more, really talked about where we stood and what we wanted for the future. It became clear that neither of us could continue pretending. Our marriage was over. It wasn't easy, of course. The thought of separating, of breaking up our family was terrifying. We had 2 young children who depended on us, and the idea of not being with them every day broke my heart. But as hard as it was, I knew that staying in a marriage that wasn't working would ultimately do more harm than good. By the end of that month, we made the decision to separate. It was a mutual agreement, one made out of love and respect for each other and for the family we had built together. The process was emotional, and there were days when I wondered if we had made the right choice. But deep down, I knew it was the only path forward. And so, the chapter of my life that had started with so much hope and promise came to a close. But little did I know, this ending was also the beginning of something new. A journey of self-discovery, healing, and ultimately, a second chance at happiness. The moment my ex-husband and I decided to separate, reality hit hard. The day we mutually agreed that our marriage was over, it felt like a weight had been lifted, but also like a heavy new burden had settled in. What now? How would we handle this? And most importantly, how would we protect our children from the emotional storm that was about to hit? I went from feeling a strange sense of relief to being overwhelmed by fear, uncertainty, and guilt. Our kids were still so young. Our daughter was 8, and our son was only 5. I knew that separating from their father would affect them deeply, and the thought of explaining to them that their parents were no longer going to live together tore me apart inside. But as much as I wanted to shield them from the pain, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. They deserved to know the truth, and they needed reassurance that, despite everything, both of their parents still loved them deeply. The day we told them was one of the hardest moments of my life. My ex-husband and I sat them down in the living room. I could see the confusion in their eyes. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't understand what was coming. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice shaking but steady enough to get the words out. "Mommy and Daddy love you both so much, and we always will," I said, holding back the tears. "But sometimes adults grow apart, and we've decided it's best for us to live in separate homes." I'll never forget the look on their faces. Our daughter's eyes filled with tears, and our son didn't quite grasp the gravity of the situation, but he hugged me tightly as if he could feel the shift in our family dynamic. I tried to comfort them, explaining that nothing would change in terms of our love and care for them, but deep down I knew everything would be different. The hardest part of the divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the fact that my children's lives would now be divided between 2 homes. For the first few weeks, it felt like I was living in a daze. I was still working part-time as a graphic designer, but my focus was all over the place. Between packing up my belongings, trying to create a new routine for the kids, and adjusting to the idea that I was now single, it was hard to find my footing. Nights were the loneliest. The quiet in the house when the kids were with their dad was deafening. I went from being surrounded by the chaos of family life to sitting alone with my thoughts, replaying every moment of our marriage, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. I struggled to balance everything. My emotions were a mess. I felt sadness, anger, and at times even guilt. I kept questioning whether we had made the right decision. Could we have tried harder? Was there something I could have done differently to save the marriage? But the truth was, we had both done the best we could. We had grown apart, and no amount of staying together for the sake of the kids would have changed that. My friends were my saving grace during this time. They were there for me in ways I didn't expect, checking in, listening when I needed to vent, and reminding me that I was strong enough to get through this. But there were still moments when the loneliness felt unbearable. It's hard to describe the feeling of going from being in a partnership, even an unhappy one, to being alone. For years I had defined myself as part of a couple, and now that part of my identity was gone. One of the toughest adjustments was navigating the new co-parenting arrangement. We had decided that the kids would split their time between my home and my ex-husband's. It was what we both thought was best for them, but I wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt to be apart from my children for days at a time. I missed their laughter, their little routines, and even the chaos that came with raising two young kids. When they were with their dad, the house felt so empty. But as difficult as it was, I knew this was a necessary step for all of us. I had to learn how to be okay with the quiet, to fill my time with things that brought me joy again, and to find a new sense of purpose outside of being a wife and mother. In some ways, it felt like I was meeting myself again for the first time in years. During those early months of separation, I started to focus more on my work. Graphic design had always been a passion of mine, but with the demands of marriage and motherhood, I had never given it the attention it deserved. Now, with more time on my hands, I threw myself into new projects, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to my family. It was a small but significant reminder that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet. Still, the hardest part of it all was watching my kids navigate this new reality. There were days when they struggled with the back and forth between homes, and I did everything I could to make the transition as smooth as possible. But I couldn't protect them from the pain of it all. That's the thing about divorce, it doesn't just affect the couple. It ripples through the entire family. Even with all the challenges, I held on to the belief that we had made the right decision. Staying in a marriage that wasn't working would have set the wrong example for our kids. They deserved to see their parents happy, even if that meant seeing us apart. And as much as I missed having them with me every day, I knew they needed their father in their lives too. The months that followed our separation were a roller coaster of emotions. There were good days where I felt like I was finding my way again, and there were bad days where the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry. But through it all, I reminded myself that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. And no matter how hard it was, I was determined to come out the other side stronger. A few months after the separation, I started to see a small light at the end of what felt like an endless tunnel. The initial shock had worn off, and while the pain still lingered, I began to realize that this new chapter in my life wasn't just about loss. It was about rediscovery. One of the first things I had to confront was my identity. For so many years I had been Jessica, the wife, or Jessica, the mom. My entire world had revolved around my marriage and my children. I loved my kids more than anything, but I started to realize that somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of Jessica, the individual. For the first time in years, I had to think about what made me happy. What did I want from life? What dreams had I put on hold to prioritize my family? It wasn't an easy process. In fact, it was downright terrifying at times. But with every small step I took toward rediscovering myself, I felt a little more empowered. One of the first things I did was throw myself into my work. As a graphic designer, I had always loved creating, but my career had taken a backseat to the demands of being a wife and mother. Now that I had more time to focus on it, I started taking on new clients, expanding my portfolio, and challenging myself creatively in ways I hadn't done before. It was refreshing to feel that sense of accomplishment again, to know that I was capable of building something on my own. My work became a form of therapy for me, an outlet where I could pour all the emotions I was struggling to process. But work wasn't enough to fill the void. I realized that I had to rebuild myself not just professionally, but personally as well. I started small, doing things that I had always wanted to try but never made time for. I signed up for a yoga class at the local studio, something I had talked about doing for years but always pushed aside. At first I felt awkward, like I didn't belong there. But with each session I started to feel more connected to my body, more grounded in the present moment. Yoga became a safe space for me, a place where I could focus solely on myself without feeling guilty about it. I also began to reconnect with old hobbies. When I was younger, I loved to paint. It was something I hadn't done in years, but one day I decided to dust off my old brushes and give it a try. The first few strokes felt awkward, but soon I fell back into the rhythm of it, losing myself in the colors and the canvas. Painting became another way for me to process the emotions I had been holding on to. With each new piece, I felt like I was putting a part of myself back together. One of the biggest shifts, though, was learning how to be okay with the quiet. When you're married with children, your life is full of noise. There's always something happening, someone needing your attention, or a new task to tackle. After the separation, the quiet felt unsettling. When the kids were with their dad, the silence in the house was deafening. At first, I filled that silence with distractions. TV shows, phone calls, anything to keep me from sitting with my thoughts. But slowly I began to embrace it. I started to use that quiet time as an opportunity to reflect, to journal, to meditate. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. As the months went by, I started to notice changes in myself. I felt stronger, more independent. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I was married, and in many ways that was a good thing. I had been so focused on being everything to everyone else that I had forgotten how to be there for myself. Now I was learning to prioritize my own needs and dreams. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still tough days, moments when the loneliness crept in and I questioned whether I was truly happy on my own. But those moments became fewer and farther between. I was starting to build a life that was mine, not defined by my relationship status or the roles I played in other people's lives. Around this time, I began to open myself up to the idea of dating again. It wasn't something I had expected to do so soon, but life has a funny way of surprising you. I met someone through a mutual friend, and though I was hesitant at first, we hit it off. He was kind, thoughtful, and most importantly, he understood that I was still healing. There was no pressure to rush into anything, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope for the future. But even as I began this new relationship, I was mindful of not losing myself in it. I had worked too hard to rediscover who I was, and I wasn't willing to let that go. This time I promised myself things would be different. I would be different. My ex-husband and I were still navigating co-parenting, and while it wasn't always easy, we were learning how to communicate better for the sake of the kids. The bitterness and anger that had lingered after the separation were starting to fade, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. We both wanted what was best for our children, and that common ground helped us find a way to move forward. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't always easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. I was learning to be okay with the fact that life doesn't always turn out the way you expect it to. Sometimes the detours lead you to places you never knew you needed to go. This chapter of my life was all about rediscovery, rediscovering my passions, my strength, and my sense of self. It was a journey of learning to stand on my own 2 feet again, and while there were moments of doubt and fear, there were also moments of clarity and hope. I was beginning to see that divorce wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new one. By the time I felt like I had rebuilt my life and started to feel comfortable in my own skin again, something unexpected happened. Love. I didn't plan on falling in love so soon after my divorce. In fact, I was convinced that relationships were something I wouldn't pursue for a long time, if ever. After the emotional roller coaster of separating from my ex-husband, the idea of opening myself up to someone new seemed daunting, if not impossible. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. I met Eric through a mutual friend. It wasn't one of those whirlwind romances you see in the movies. It was slow, steady, and honestly, exactly what I needed. We were introduced at a small gathering, and initially, I wasn't even thinking about dating. But there was something about Eric's presence that put me at ease. He had this quiet confidence, not in a boastful way, but in a way that made you feel like everything was going to be okay just by being around him. We started off as friends. I told myself that's all it was going to be. After all, I was still healing, still processing my divorce, and still figuring out how to co-parent and live a life that felt like mine. But as we spent more time together, I started to realize that I enjoyed being around him more than I had expected. He really listened to what I had to say. And he didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions. He was just there, supportive and understanding. It wasn't long before we both knew there was something more between us. But even then, I was cautious. I had worked so hard to rediscover myself, to build my independence, and the last thing I wanted was to lose myself in a new relationship. I had done that once before, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. But Eric wasn't like my ex-husband. He didn't make me feel like I had to choose between my identity and our relationship. He was patient, kind, and most importantly, he respected the boundaries I had set for myself. One of the things that drew me to him was his understanding of my situation. He knew I was a mother first and that my children came before anything else. He never pushed me to introduce him to my kids too early, and he respected the fact that my ex-husband was still a big part of my life due to co-parenting. It wasn't easy to navigate these waters, but Eric made it easier. He understood that I had two lives to balance, the one with my kids and the one I was starting to build with him. Eventually, though, the time came for him to meet my children. I was nervous, terrified even. I didn't want to disrupt their lives more than I already had. But as I had done from the beginning, I approached this new chapter with honesty and openness. I sat my kids down and explained that I had met someone who was important to me, but that their feelings were my top priority. Their reactions were mixed, as expected. My daughter, being older, had more questions. She wanted to know if this meant I would spend less time with them, if it meant things were going to change even more. I reassured her that nothing would change between us, that my love for them would always come first. My son, being younger, was more curious than anything. He didn't fully grasp what it meant for me to be in a new relationship, but he trusted me. The first meeting between Eric and my children was a quiet dinner at my house. I made sure to keep things light and casual, not wanting to overwhelm anyone. Eric, to his credit, handled it with grace. He didn't try too hard or force a connection. He just let things happen naturally. Over time, my kids warmed up to him, and slowly but surely, they accepted that this new person was a part of my life. As my relationship with Eric deepened, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come since the divorce. There were moments when I wondered if I was rushing into things, if I was ready to love someone again. But with each passing day, I realized that this was different. This wasn't about filling a void or trying to replace what I had lost. This was about moving forward, about embracing the possibility of love in a new and healthier way. My ex-husband was still a presence in my life because of the kids, and while our interactions were sometimes awkward, we had developed a new sense of respect for each other. We weren't the same people we had been when we were married, and that was okay. We had both moved on, and though it was strange to navigate this new chapter where we were no longer partners but co-parents, it worked. Eric never tried to insert himself into the dynamic between my ex-husband and me. He respected our boundaries and understood that the kids needed both of us in their lives. There were moments of tension, of course. Times when I worried about how everything would fit together, how I could balance my new relationship with my responsibilities as a mother. But those moments were fleeting. Over time, I learned that it wasn't about balance at all. It was about integration, finding a way to weave the pieces of my life together into a cohesive whole. As my relationship with Eric grew, so did my sense of peace. I had spent so much time after the divorce feeling like I had to prove to myself that I could do it all on my own. But now, I realized that part of healing was accepting that it was okay to let someone else in. It didn't make me any less strong, any less independent. In fact, it made me stronger. I had found someone who valued and respected the woman I had become, someone who was willing to stand beside me without trying to change me. This chapter of my life was one of new beginnings, not just in love but in the way I saw myself. I wasn't the same woman who had walked away from her marriage, and that was a good thing. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. Falling in love again was one thing, but navigating the complexities of blending two families was another challenge entirely. As my relationship with Eric deepened, we began to talk about the future, what it would look like for us to take the next step and move in together. It wasn't a decision we took lightly, especially with my kids involved. We both understood that blending families wasn't just about him and me. It was about creating a new, cohesive unit that would be healthy and happy for everyone. The first step was bringing Eric closer into my children's lives. By now, they had accepted him as part of my world, but moving in together was a much bigger deal. My daughter, now 9, was hesitant at first. She asked a lot of questions, ones I couldn't always answer right away. What if he doesn't like living with us? What if I don't like living with him? She asked one night, her face scrunched with worry. Her concerns weren't just about Eric. They were about the life we had been building after the divorce. In some ways, our routine had become our safety net. It was predictable, and though it wasn't perfect, it was something we understood. Adding someone new into that routine felt like a risk, and my daughter wasn't the only one who felt it. I was scared too. As much as I loved Eric, there was always the fear that things might not work out, that the dynamics we had worked so hard to create after the divorce could fall apart with this new chapter. But I reminded myself that fear was natural, and I couldn't let it hold me back from moving forward. Eric was incredibly patient throughout the process. He never pushed, never made me feel like we had to rush into anything. We spent time talking with the kids, reassuring them that this wasn't about replacing their dad or disrupting the life we had built. It was about adding to it, creating something new together. Over time, their anxieties eased, and eventually, we made the decision to move in as a family. The first few months were an adjustment, to say the least. There were moments when I wondered if we had made the right choice. Eric didn't have children of his own, so stepping into the role of a parental figure was new territory for him. There were days when the kids pushed boundaries, testing how far they could go with him, and it took time for everyone to figure out their place in this new dynamic. But Eric handled it with grace. He wasn't trying to be their father. He knew that role was already filled by my ex-husband, but he was there to support them, to be a positive presence in their lives. Slowly but surely, they began to trust him more, and I could see the bond between them growing. He became someone they could rely on, someone who cared about their well-being as much as I did. Co-parenting with my ex-husband became a little more complicated after Eric and I moved in together. While my ex and I had developed a relatively smooth system, bringing someone new into the fold stirred up old emotions. We had to renegotiate boundaries, figure out how to communicate about the kids without stepping on each other's toes, and navigate the occasional awkwardness of having another adult in the picture. There were times when tensions flared, times when my ex-husband wasn't sure how to deal with Eric's growing role in the kids' lives. But we kept the lines of communication open, and ultimately, we both agreed that what mattered most was our children's happiness and stability. Eric never overstepped, and he made sure to respect the relationship my ex-husband had with the kids. It was a delicate balance, but over time we made it work. Building this new blended family came with its ups and downs, but there were also moments of real joy. We began creating new traditions as a family: weekend hikes, movie nights, and even a summer road trip. The kids started to look forward to these moments, and I could see how much they had grown to care for Eric. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were finding our rhythm, slowly but surely. As my relationship with Eric grew, so did my confidence in the life we were building together. I had spent so much time after the divorce feeling like I had to prove to myself, and to everyone else, that I could do it on my own, that I didn't need anyone to be whole. But blending our families taught me something important. Independence doesn't mean isolation. I didn't have to do it all alone, and letting someone in didn't make me any less strong. In fact, it made me stronger. One of the most significant moments in this journey came when my ex-husband and I dropped our oldest off at college. It was a milestone that felt both exciting and bittersweet. As we stood there side by side, watching our daughter take her first steps into adulthood, I realized how far we had come. Divorce had been the end of one chapter, but it wasn't the end of our family. It was simply the beginning of a new, different kind of family. Eric was by my side through it all, offering support without ever trying to take center stage. He understood that my children had a father and that his role was to be an additional source of love and guidance in their lives. Watching the way he loved my kids made me love him even more. Blending our families wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was also one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. It taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who love you, and who are willing to build something new with you, even when the road ahead is uncertain. As I stood there with Eric, my ex-husband, and our children, I realized that we had created something beautiful. It wasn't the family I had imagined when I first got married, but it was ours. And that made it perfect in its own way. As I sit here now, reflecting on the past decade since my divorce, it feels surreal to think about how much has changed. Life looks nothing like I imagined it would, and yet, I feel more at peace than I ever thought possible. Divorce wasn't the end for me. It was the beginning of a new chapter that forced me to grow, to learn, and to become the person I am today. In the beginning, I thought my life had fallen apart. I had defined myself by my marriage, by my role as a wife and mother, and losing that felt like losing myself. But as the years went by, I began to realize that sometimes things have to fall apart for something new to be built in their place. Divorce didn't break me, it gave me the strength to rebuild. One of the most important lessons I learned through all of this is that healing is not linear. There were days when I felt like I was moving forward, and days when it felt like I was stuck in place, reliving the pain of my marriage ending. But over time, the bad days became fewer and farther between. I found joy in the little things again. I learned how to be content with my own company. I realized that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet, and that I didn't need anyone to complete me. That was perhaps the most liberating realization of all. For so long I had relied on others, my ex-husband, my kids, even my friends, to define who I was. But now I know that I am enough just as I am. I'm no longer afraid of being alone, because I've learned to love and appreciate myself in ways I never did before. Of course, my life didn't stay alone forever. Falling in love with Eric was unexpected, but it taught me that love can come in many different forms. This time around, I approached love with more caution, more wisdom. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me. I was looking for someone who complemented the life I had already built. Eric became that person for me, not by trying to fix me or fill a void, but by being a partner who supported my growth and respected my independence. Building our blended family was one of the biggest challenges of my life, but also one of the most rewarding. We've had our ups and downs, moments of tension and adjustment, but through it all, we've become stronger together. I've watched my children grow into resilient, loving young people who have adapted to this new family dynamic with grace. They know they are loved, by both me and their father, and now by Eric too. And that, more than anything, is what matters most to me. Co-parenting with my ex-husband hasn't always been easy, but we've come a long way. We've learned how to communicate better, how to put our differences aside for the sake of our children. Dropping our daughter off at college together was a bittersweet moment, a reminder of how far we've come and how much we've both grown since the divorce. In that moment, I realized that while we may not be partners anymore, we will always be connected through our children. And that's a bond that will never go away. Now, as I move forward into this next chapter of my life, I feel a sense of calm that I haven't felt in years. The chaos and uncertainty of the divorce have given way to something much more stable and fulfilling. I've built a career that I'm proud of, a home filled with love, and a family that may not look traditional, but is perfect in its own way. To anyone out there who is going through the pain of divorce, I want to say this. It's not the end of your story. It may feel like everything is falling apart, but sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen for something better to come together. You will find your strength, your happiness, and your sense of self again. It may take time and it may not be easy, but you will get there. One of the most important things I've learned is that life doesn't follow a straight line. There will be detours, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But those detours can lead you to places you never thought you'd go. My divorce was one of those detours. It was painful and heartbreaking, but it also gave me the opportunity to rediscover who I am, to build a life that is true to me. I used to think that divorce was a failure. I used to feel ashamed of the fact that my marriage didn't last. But now I know that divorce is not a failure. It's simply a change in direction. It's the acknowledgement that sometimes people grow apart and that's okay. It doesn't mean you've failed. It just means you're moving on to a new chapter. So here I am, 10 years later, with a blended family, a career that I love, and a sense of self that is stronger than ever. My life is far from perfect, but it's mine, and I'm proud of the person I've become through this journey. Divorce didn't break me, it made me. And for that I am grateful. What we can learn from divorce according to the Bible. A journey of healing and faith. Divorce is one of life's most difficult trials, filled with heartache, uncertainty, and a sense of loss. However, as Christians, we can find comfort and guidance in the Bible during even the most challenging seasons of life. The story of Jessica Carter's journey through divorce offers a powerful example of how faith can sustain us, how healing is possible, and how God's grace remains ever present. Here, we will explore what we can learn from her experience in light of biblical teachings, and how it can inspire those facing similar circumstances to lean on God and find hope. 1. God's design for marriage and the reality of human imperfection. Marriage is a sacred covenant, designed by God to unite two people in love and commitment. Genesis 2 verse 24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Jessica, like many others, entered her marriage full of hope, believing it would last a lifetime. But over time, she and her ex-husband grew apart, each evolving in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their love, once strong, couldn't withstand the pressures and changes of life. This reflects the reality that, while God's design for marriage is lifelong, human imperfection often leads to the breakdown of relationships. Jesus acknowledges this in Matthew 19 verse 8 when he says, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning." Divorce wasn't part of God's original plan, but he understands that, in a fallen world, relationships can break. Jessica's story shows us that divorce, though painful, is sometimes necessary. It's not about failure, but about acknowledging when a relationship no longer reflects the love and unity that God intended. In such moments, we must trust that God's grace covers us, even in our brokenness. 2. God's unfailing love amidst the pain. One of the most comforting aspects of Jessica's story is how she discovered that even as her marriage ended, God's love for her never did. Divorce often feels like an overwhelming loss of identity, of stability, and of the future we once imagined. For Jessica, the days and weeks following her separation were filled with confusion and grief. But during this time, she found solace in her faith, understanding that God's love remained constant. Romans 8 verses 38 to 39 reminds us that nothing can separate us from the love of God. "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Jessica's story teaches us that no matter the depth of our pain, God's love endures. Divorce may mark the end of a chapter, but it is not the end of God's plan for us. Through her journey, Jessica learned to lean on God's promises. She embraced the truth that, despite the hardship, God had not abandoned her. His love was her constant, giving her the strength to face each day and rebuild her life. 3. The power of forgiveness and healing. Forgiveness plays a crucial role in Jessica's healing journey. Divorce often brings feelings of betrayal, anger, and hurt, making forgiveness one of the hardest steps. For Jessica, navigating the emotional aftermath of her marriage breakdown was no easy task. She had to forgive not only her ex-husband but also herself for the way things had turned out. The Bible teaches us that forgiveness is key to healing. In Ephesians 4 verses 31 to 32, we are urged to get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Jessica's path to forgiveness was gradual, took time, prayer, and reflection. But by choosing to forgive, she released the heavy burden of bitterness, allowing God to heal her heart and bring peace. Jessica's story reminds us that forgiveness is not about excusing wrongs or forgetting the pain. Instead, it is about allowing God's grace to work through us, releasing the hold that anger and resentment have on our hearts. By forgiving, we open ourselves to the healing that only God can provide, giving us the freedom to move forward. For God's purpose in our pain. Jessica's divorce, though painful, led to significant personal growth. As she navigated life as a single mother, rediscovered her passions, and eventually found love again, she realized that God was using her pain for good. Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Through her divorce, Jessica found strength she didn't know she had. She learned to stand on her own, to embrace her independence, and to trust that God had a purpose for her life beyond the marriage. What seemed like an end was, in fact, a new beginning, a chance for her to grow in faith, build a new life, and even create a blended family full of love and grace. Her story reflects the biblical truth that God can use even our most painful experiences to shape us into who He's calling us to be. Jessica's journey through divorce became an opportunity for her to draw closer to God, deepen her faith, and be an example to others who are walking through similar challenges. 5. A future filled with hope. The Bible promises that no matter the trials we face, God has a future planned for us, one filled with hope. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is a powerful reminder. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jessica's story beautifully illustrates this promise. After her divorce, Jessica feared for her future. Would she ever find happiness again? Would her family ever feel whole? But as she continued to trust God, He led her to new opportunities for love, joy, and purpose. Her blended family, though different from what she initially envisioned, became a source of deep fulfillment. She discovered that God's plans for her life were far greater than she could have imagined. Jessica's story encourages us to trust in God's promises, even when the road ahead seems unclear. Divorce may change our circumstances, but it doesn't change God's faithfulness. He is always working for our good, and His plans are full of hope.